Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby.
Hello and welcome to Movies vs. Capitalism, an anti-capitalist movie podcast. This is Frank.
And this is Rivka, and it's post-election, so here we fucking are.
Here we fucking are. Yeah, recording this on Wednesday, November 13th, so 1 week after Donald Trump won re-election, Kamala Harris and the Democrats ate major shit. You know, we're just going to talk a little bit here at the top, because honestly, what are we going to say that you probably already haven't heard a million times in a million other places? Riv, what has your week been? How have you been processing, grieving, dealing?
I think it's been, it's been okay. Hasn't fully all hit me. I think I was grieving, I really was kind of feeling it coming the days right before Election Day. So I was sort of preparing, feeling a little bit more prepared. Mm-hmm. I was more furious. I think I was really, really angry more than the 2016 feeling of shock and what the fuck is happening. It didn't feel like that. It felt more just really furious and angry. And I think contradictory feelings, feeling furious, angry, and also equally hopeful, because I do, and I talked to you about this, I felt like there was a profound clarity in the aftermath. Mm-hmm. Where even people who I felt their analysis of what the Democratic Party could do for us in that moment, it just didn't feel clear, or it's touched grass, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that I'm hearing a lot more clarity and understanding. And it's also terrifying. I mean, it's also absolutely terrifying. And I'm trying to just stay in the present. And I'm really trying, I guess, for my self-care, I'm just really trying not to fully go off into what's to come, because there's many bad things, but there may also be many hopeful, wonderful things. And I have to hold on to all of that contradiction to survive. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very similar, honestly. I also felt this coming. I think I was actually a little bit more hopeful in the day or two leading up to the election that, maybe she might actually turn it out, The vibes are great. The vibes were not enough.
And the vibes weren't great. Not in my neighborhood.
Also the vibes were not great.
The vibes were not great. What was your name? I know I felt it when I went to vote, and there were people from my neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood that is, again, it's when we were talking about the Rami Youssef stand up about you don't have to go south. You just got to go South Brooklyn. You just got to go down south in the block that I'm in, and there were some old ladies out in their MAGA hats,
damn.
Mm-hmm. And there were a few people who were ahead of us to vote who hadn't been out in the last two elections. And that's when I got really scared, because I was this is when Bernie brought people out who'd never voted before.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're totally fine. Yeah, no, I live in a historically black neighborhood, so no, not as many MAGA hats. I don't think that shit would fly as well here.
Yep.
Although Trump increased his margins with every non-white demographic, with young people, with everyone. So, I mean, hey, who knows?
A real multicultural campaign.
the real multiracial, multicultural movement we've been looking for. No, I've also been feeling furious, and specifically furious at the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, actually. Mm-hmm. We could be a little bit mad at Kamala, but really, I've been trying to just at least guide people to, hey, let's be angry at Joe Biden and the Democratic leadership, because they're the ones who really fucked us. And especially the stuff we're learning now about Biden's team and how much they knew going into primary season about his unfitness, about how he was so unpopular, how he was going to get shellacked by Trump, and they just didn't fucking tell anyone and insisted that he remain the nominee, whatever.
And then gave her so little,
and then gave so little time. Yeah. So just so furious. But the other thing I've been trying to tell at least people I speak with is that I really don't see this election as a full-throated support for Trumpism.
Yes.
I'm looking at it as a full-throated rebuke of the Democrats
And systems. And I think it's like a large amount of people. Yeah. The people who voted and the people who didn't vote and how they voted. I think it's like you're like a rebuke of like, things are not working. Something's not working. And what the fuck do you do in a duopoly about that?
Yeah.
And a striving to figure that out. So for some people that was like not showing up. For some people that was voting for Trump and then also voting for AOC, or voting for Trump and voting for policies that he's completely against. So like a deep confusion, which I don't think you can blame the voter for. Yes, you can blame misinformation, but like largely what you blame is like this mediocre system where people are left feeling like lesser of two evils is not a strong fucking calling card.
No.
Like regardless, it's just not it. And so us having to strive to like, yeah, wherever that leaves all of us. But I think, you know, grasping for like, what do I have access to? What do we have access for? And I think all of us have our different superpowers and who we are in our communities and how we become helpers to each other. But I think it's a moment for how do you combat misinformation education? And I think helping, how do we now really, you know, there's a grief that has to happen. And depending on who you are in this system and how this is going to impact you, we have different levels of privilege and different ways in which this will absolutely impact us. And I think that's what's really scary is knowing, like, I know I'm not one of those people that it's going to be coming for in that extreme way so fast. I mean, but that is coming. And so it has been helpful to know that there are community organizations, there's leaders and organizers who for that, you wouldn't be able to wake up and do all that. Like they've been putting in the work. So I think people can turn to those places and help there. But then I think also like having conversations, not turning away from, I think like one of the worst things we can do is just further create a divide of, I just can't even talk to you.
Yeah.
Not meaning like put yourself in harm. And I think with family, especially, that's like, obviously there's varied levels of trauma and whatever that is.
Sure.
But like, maybe that's kind of what I think I really felt that way in 2016. And I think that's how I've probably changed is I really used to feel like if you fucking voted that way, you're racist, you're misogynist, and I can't fuck with you. And now I think there's like a, you know, for those of us who voted for Kamala and didn't want to, we had to hold our nose. And I think there's probably people who voted for Trump and didn't want to. And knowing that that is actually something that we can take advantage of if we're going to build a working class empowered movement moving forward.
At 100%. I think this moment presents a unique opportunity for people on the left like us to drill down on our messaging and our ideas, to bring along people into the fold, especially now in this moment, like disaffected liberals who might now be getting off of the blue Kool-Aid, who might now be thinking, you know, maybe Pod didn't save America. You know,
oh my God.
But truly, because I think people like you're saying, people inherently understand that the system is broken. And the way I've been trying to refine my messaging, and I've repeated this now in a few conversations, mainly with family members, is, you know, the two things you have to understand about the average American voter is, one, they do not follow politics whatsoever, and two, they understand that the status quo does not work, aka that the system is fucked. So if you are the presidential candidate showing up once every 4 years and you're not starting your pitch with, hey, the system is fucking broken, no one is going to listen to you. No one is going to listen to you. And that's what Trump does. But, you know, his prescription is obviously fascism. It's like targeting marginalized communities, undocumented immigrants, trans folks, women, what have you.
And serving the billionaire class. He just does a really great job, like taking advantage of people's like deeply ingrained belief that they maybe one day too, the American dream will work and they can become part of that class too.
Yeah, and it's a complete sham proposition, but he is at least speaking to, at the beginning, he's speaking to the reality that everyone understands. You know, people may be underinformed. They may be misinformed, but people are not stupid. People understand inherently that this shit does not work. So if you're not starting there as a political candidate, then like, what are you even doing? Don't waste anyone's time. But then you go to the actual constructive Bernie Sanders style of populism of, no, the enemy is actually the billionaire class. It's corporations. It's the plutocracy that has completely captured our government. Like, those are the actual bad guys. So yeah, so I hope
the thing that you call the elite, we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Sorry, Trump is the head of that shit. Like, they're all in bed together. They all have solidarity.
Yeah. But I'm hopeful that this is an opportunity similar to the pandemic. I'm hoping that this is an opportunity where, where more
There's
people
the deep contradictions, and there will be those deep contradictions for sure. A lot of people will suffer. We know that. And hopefully, and I do really believe, I think there will be a lot of good that we see coming in the next 4 years, and a lot of new radical thinking, new ideas, a lot of great art. I think people will really find their ways to help.
I think so. All right. Well, that's, I think, all we needed to say about the election. Did you have anything? Any final thoughts? No? You're good?
We mentioned this before. We won a Signal Award.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Some happy news. And we went to the award party last night, and that was really fun and cool.
Yeah.
We got to see friend of the pod, David Sirota.
Mm-hmm.
I fangirled because Esther Perel was there, and I kept saying that to people, and they're like, who is that? I'm like, she's a famous therapist. Go to therapy.
There was some poor bastard who looked exactly like JD Vance.
Oh, God. Frank took some...
I tried to take some pictures.
Secret photos.
I felt bad for that guy. I was like, this dude is going to have the roughest next 4 years. Well, not him. Other people are going to have it more rough, but would hate hate to look like JD Vance right now.
Well, I guess it depends on where you are. I mean...
That's true, yeah.
You know? There's some old broads in this hood who would be very happy to have JD Vance around.
Yeah,
God.
just you take that little Cabbage Patch Boy and just toss him around their rent-controlled apartment.
Yeah, they were very fun. So that's some positive news, and it's thanks to all of you. And this is a really important community. I just have to reiterate in this, you know, as we're also thinking about like what we can do and feeling like reinvigorated about like having these guests on, and like how much I value these conversations that we get to have, and also the commentary that we get to have with all of you, be it on Patreon or emails. It means a lot.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of which, if you don't know it already, a little bit about us. We don't sell ads on this show. We rely on community support to keep the show going. So if you'd like to support us, you could do that by subscribing to our Patreon account.
That's right. For $5 a month, you get access to new bonus episodes and in our entire back catalog. And now $5 a month, there's not much you can get in this town anymore for $5. And yet we're offering you a whole catalog and new bonus episodes. So get on it. Our Patreon link is in the episode description in your podcast player, or you can find it at mvcpod.com. Also, if you could rate, review, subscribe to this podcast on your podcast player, it helps other people find it and you won't miss new episodes.
All right, we're going to take a break, but right back with our conversation about Saturday Night Fever with returning guest John Shelton. And just a heads up, we did record this conversation with John before the election. Enjoy.
Theater and film lovers of Caribbean heritage, are you looking for a company that develops, produces, and presents new plays and films by all artists of Caribbean heritage? Well, you've been looking for Conch Shell Productions, publishers of Reset Series, a collection of new short plays by Caribbean and multicultural BIPOC writers, Conch Shell International Film Fest, online artist chats and play readings, and an annual new play festival.
At Conch Shell Productions, the goal is to create a space for a community of artists to own their narrative and for audiences like you to experience shows that give a voice to your diverse experiences and viewpoints. You can go to conchshellproductions.com or follow this inclusive arts organization on social media at Conch Shell Productions.
I've been a member of Conch Shell Productions Artist Collective for 2 years, and this community has played a very important role in my anti-capitalism and artist practice. This month, we're asking our community to consider, what does it mean to decolonize theater? especially as Caribbean diaspora and Caribbean artists, as well as artists of the world. Our community discussion will be streamed on our YouTube channel at Conchal Productions on July 28th. Follow us on Instagram to get updates about our chats and productions.
Today, we are once again joined by John Shelton. John is the professor and chair of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He's the author of The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumped Social Democracy. And John also serves as vice president of higher education for the American Federation of Teachers, Wisconsin. John, welcome back to Movies versus Capitalism.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. And I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate you both on the big award, the Signal Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Happy to play a small part in that.
Thank you. Well, it was more than small. You brought a huge amount to that conversation.
Yes. So we just found out today, as a matter of fact, that we won the bronze medal in this year's Signal Awards in the Best Television and Film podcast category. And the episode that we had submitted was our Back to the Future episode, which John was our guest on. So I also second Rivka's sentiment that you brought quite a bit to that episode. In fact, in re-listening to it and submitting it, I was very, very proud of that submission because it was one of the most densely packed analyses that still remained like a fun conversation about a movie we all love that we have done so far. So, John, thank you again.
Good. You're very welcome. Although I still think Michael J. Fox deserves a lot of the credit. So.
Sure.
You know, obviously people will be listening to this after the election. So, you probably know there's election happening here pretty soon. And in Wisconsin, we're like, battleground central. So we are paying a lot of attention to that. And that's kind of taken up all my time the past couple of months. But I think hopefully this doesn't sound terrible when this comes out, but I think we're going to be okay and live to fight another day. That's how I'm feeling about it. So
good.
Okay.
That's really nice
a lot of
to
people
hear.
in this state have put in a lot of work. We had a very important election back in April for a state Supreme Court justice. And, people have just kind of not stopped. We know the importance of Wisconsin and people are hard at work here. So that's what I've been doing.
Amazing. Great to hear.
Encouraging to hear, yes.
Yeah, very encouraging to hear. So let's dive into this movie because I'm so excited to talk about it with you. We're talking today about Saturday Night Fever, directed by John Badham, written by Norman Wexler, based on the story Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night by Nick Cohn, with original music by the Bee Gees, starring John Travolta, Karen Lynn Gorney, Donna Pascal, Martin Shaker, and Barry Miller. The budget for this movie was $3 million, and it grossed $237 million worldwide.
God damn.
Damn.
Massive. For 1977. Yeah, that's huge.
Unbelievable. This film tells the story of Tony Manero, a 19-year-old Italian-American paint store clerk who moonlights as the king of the dance floor at the local disco. Tony and his group of friends, aka the worst men you will ever meet in your life, reign supreme in their small pond of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where life is about fast cars, fast women, and fast casual racism. That is, until Tony meets the trained dancer, Stephanie, who agrees to compete with him for the upcoming dance contest, and their partnership shifts from professional to romantic to sexual assault in a whirlwind of disco and violence. Wow, Frank, that's one of your best. Frank
Thank
wrote
you.
that synopsis. That was
Very good.
awesome.
Thank you very much. It'd been a long time since I seen this movie. I completely forgotten what it was about.
Yep.
So before we get into our movie conversation, a little bit of historical context from when this film was released. And John, I'm glad you're here because you can fill in any gaps that we may not have covered. So this movie was released on December 16th, 1977. This is the first movie we have covered from this year. In January, Jimmy Carter is sworn in as the 39th president of the United States. In February, Fleetwood Mac's Grammy Award-winning album Rumors is released. In May, the movie Star Wars, ever heard of it? Directed by George Lucas, is released in theaters. In June, the Humboldt Park riot takes place in Chicago, the second major conflict between Puerto Ricans in Chicago and the Chicago Police Department following the shooting deaths of 2 Puerto Rican men. In August, David Berkowitz is captured in Yonkers, New York after over a year of murders in New York City as the son of Sam Killer. In September, the modern food stamp program begins when the food Stamp Act of 1977 is enacted. In November, San Francisco elects City Supervisor Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official of any large city in the U.S. And ongoing, we are still in the middle of the 1970s energy crisis here in the United States. John, I'll ask you, because I think you probably have a little bit more grip on this history. Was there anything else that was happening around this time that you think would be important to know historically?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of big picture stuff. So the 1970s are just an absolutely fascinating decade, and one of the reasons that I suggested this film, for those listening, I don't know if we're going to get into this, but I was talking with Frank and Rivka about which film to do, and we were thinking maybe Back to the Future 2, but there's not as much there, I think, as Back to the Future 1. And, so I suggested a film in the 1970s, and the 1970s has always fascinated me. It was actually the topic of my first book, Before the Education Myth. And the 1970s were a decade when really all of the political assumptions in the United States kind of flipped on their head. You mentioned some of the crises. You had massive deindustrialization on a large scale, so lots of corporations shifting jobs overseas. You had fiscal crises and with the economic downturn happening at the same time as inflation, by the way. So I don't know what the inflation rate was exactly in 1977, but it was probably about as high as it's been in this country the past few years, right? Mm-hmm. There were a few years in the 70s where inflation was double digits. And so, this was a serious concern for people. But in contrast to our time, where you have inflation, but we supposedly have a good economy and low unemployment. In the 1970s, you actually had this phenomenon called stagflation, economic stagnation and inflation at the same time. Macroeconomists before that actually thought that was impossible to have both of those things at once.
Wait, you're saying economists don't know everything that's going to happen all the time?
Economists, as it turns out, don't know a lot, actually. I'm sorry if anybody listening to this is an economist. I'm not sorry if you're offended. I'm just sorry if you're an economist. But there's some good ones out there, but they've done a lot to ruin the way that we think about how the world works, in my view. But economists in the 70s kind of thought this had been impossible. And there was even... I'm trying to think if it was Ford or Carter who sort of used this, but they actually talked about this thing called the misery index, which was like the combination of inflation and unemployment, and that would tell you how bad the economy was. And so, the thing to remember about, and we'll get into this, but I just want to prompt people for this, the thing to remember about New York City in particular in the 1970s is it's the epicenter of all of this. So New York City is a labor town. It has probably the most generous social safety net in the entire country. College tuition was actually free in the City University of New York for about the first half of the 1970s. Workers had probably the most solid collective bargaining rights of anywhere in the country. And then when this economic downturn and inflation happened, New York City bore the worst of it, actually. And the city almost went bankrupt in 1975.
Wow.
Technically, it came an hour away from becoming bankrupt, and it was actually the teachers' union pension that bailed the city out from going under and actually defaulting on loans. So you have to remember that in 1977, this is a New York City that is coming on the heels of all that, where political assumptions are being rethought. Conservatives are saying it's profligate government spending and powerful unions that are causing the economic pain. They weren't right about that. But capital's going really on the warpath in the 1970s, and that kind of paves the way for the 80s, right? And some of the things we talked about with Back to the Future. And the urban terrain in New York City, when I initially suggested this movie, I suggested some other ones too. And there's all these movies about kind of New York City as a battleground, between different races and ethnicities, but also a decaying urban infrastructure. There's some other really great movies, Taxi Driver, for example, but also The Warriors, which is a movie that if you haven't seen that one, if you're listening to this, go out and watch that. It's an absolutely incredible movie about, the kind of urban fabric in New York City.
I haven't seen it since I've been radicalized, but I would love to do a Warriors rewatch at this point in my life.
Yeah, go back and check that out. But those are all the things that are happening. And so we really can't overstate just how tumultuous the 1970s felt, and so with what happens in this movie, that's all the context for what's happening here.
Yeah, that's so important. I was so happy you chose this. Like you said, you gave us a few options, and I know I jumped in and I was like, finally, Saturday Night Fever, because I've been waiting for someone to want to do this film, because the thing that interests me about it is like there's so much class context. I mean, there's so much to say about class and about New York that like needs further unpacking, because it's like it's actually pretty dense what's packed in there. And I was also just so fascinated because this was a movie that holds such a different inherited like imagination of what it's about, and was passed down to me like in the imagination before seeing it. It's like we all have a relationship to Saturday Night Fever without seeing it as like the fun dance movie, the Bee Gees, the costumes, John Travolta. And so the expectation when I finally sat down to watch it as an adult was like, Grease adjacent. Like, this was supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be a dance movie. And what you get is so brutal, like shocking. And I'm still kind of always, like, when I watch it, trying to tackle if I feel like if it's really a representation of the time, if it has something to say. There's a lot that it says, but also like how much potential damage it could have also caused in the wake of it, in what it sort of like left in its sort of like the capitalist propaganda of it just as its own franchise, that what like became something that probably should never have been franchised, for it to keep its core message, for it to be this indie film that's actually very dark and very much a reflection of a time and potentially groups of people that we can talk about, like what those have to say, the stereotypes, etc. But that what it became because of how it was marketed and its franchise possibility, and how much money, as you heard, it like made so much money, what it became a vehicle for sort of distorted that piece of it, that nobody remembers what the film is actually about. And when you talk to people, and I like ask people who probably grew up with this when it was their time to go see this in the theaters, do you remember what Saturday Night Fever is about? They're like, yeah, it's a dance movie. Like, not really. Nobody remembers. It was just a very startling thing. I think it has a lot to say about like the myth of a film, the impact of a film beyond just what a film has to say and what that has to say about like the Hollywood structure in general. But there's so much there, so I'm pumped.
Yeah, it's almost like the horror version of Grease, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weirdly. And I think also what's interesting when you mention all the stuff with the franchise is, I recently rewatched Pulp Fiction and was reminded of how this role, and then I've never seen the sequel, but there's a sequel to this called Staying Alive.
Staying Alive, yeah.
And how this basically tanked Travolta's career for like a decade. It takes Pulp Fiction to kind of revise it, and it's because of some of the assumptions, I think. There's way more assumptions about this movie than what people actually like see when you watch it. So I'm excited to get into a lot of that stuff.
I remember, I think it was VH1 used to do the I love the 80s, I love the 70s, those whole talking head clip show things. And I remember those better because I saw this movie when I was in high school, did not remember it at all. But I remember them, like as Rivka is saying, talking about Saturday Night Fever in this reverential, happy-go-lucky way of, yeah, it's just a fun popcorn dance movie. It's the John Travolta disco movie. And yeah, how its cultural impression is completely different than the actual content of the movie. It's fascinating because this is, like you said, John, this is like it's a very dark movie. It's more dark.
Incredibly dark.
It is more dark than it is light and fun and dancey. I mean, sure, there is a 5-minute dance break in the middle where John Travolta just gets to go off, and you know what? He looks great. He's tearing it up on the dance floor. But the content of what's actually happening is so much bleaker than that.
It's like an urban gothic, and not to bury not to get ahead of ourselves, but like the thesis of this movie is basically like, if you want to succeed, you got to put all of that stuff behind you. That's literally what Travolta's character does at the end. And it's a very bleak look at urban politics and frankly, the history of, a snapshot of working people in the U.S. at that time. So I hope we get into a lot of that stuff because that's important.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will say, as an Italian American who grew up in a mostly Italian American suburb of New York City, a lot of the themes of this movie, particularly the themes of, obviously the immigrant family, mentality, that whole like the downward pressure from your parents to succeed, to supersede even their success, and also the idea of, which is played out so smartly in this movie the idea of like, you have to get out of this town, you have to get out of here if you're going to succeed, if you're going to make anything of yourself, if your life is going to have any meaning. It couldn't possibly be here. It has to be, you know, in Manhattan. It has to be at this place that has I don't know, culturally, this urban space that has culturally higher status to us for some reason. So a lot of that like really hit very close to home.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning because I feel like there's so much to talk about, but let's start at the genesis for this movie because I know you shared with us, John, that article, which is so interesting. But as we mentioned, the idea for the film, I believe the producer of the film read this article written by Nick Cohn, who is a British music critic who wrote this for The New Yorker. And this article is like, I mean, there's so much of it is the movie. Like, I feel like you feel what's so cool is you feel the source material and the themes and everything in it. I think the screenwriter did an amazing job of capturing all that in the screenplay itself. But it's pretty cool that like this article was read. The producer had a deal already with Travolta, so was looking for a picture for Travolta and said, this is it. And so from there, they were kind of building their team. Originally, it was supposed to be John Avildsen, who directed Rocky, which has a lot of reverberations in this film. And then Avildsen wanted to change, I think, a lot of the way they pictured the movie. He wanted to make it a lot more mean streets than it is. And so they changed their directors, but then the screenwriter came on. But the genesis, is from this article. But what's really fascinating about the article, I think, especially along the lines of like, how much does this represent or not, and what is the mythology of the film, the culture that the film creates itself, is that Nick Cohn later came out and said, oh yeah, well, I know I said it was based on a true story, like this was all real based on reporting, but like I kind of made it all up. And I went to the Odyssey nightclub where they actually shot the film, like that was their real set, was the nightclub that the article was written about. But he like met a guy, so there was a few things, but I think I read an article where he said someone threw up on his pants and he left and he had a deadline. So he kind of based it on this, but also a lot of it's based on his experience in the UK and the dance scene there. So yeah, I just think that's interesting that the source material itself that is so culturally specific to this Bay Ridge area is in itself an extrapolation and a lot of fiction.
Yeah, so a couple things. One really quick trivia thing that I read. I went down a little bit of a Nick Cohn rabbit hole, so first of all, he wrote a very negative review of Abbey Road, which I think should disqualify you right there from serious criticism. That's number one. Number two, apparently Pete Townsend in the Who song Pinball Wizard, the rock opera Tommy, put the song Pinball Wizard in there because he was hoping that Nick Cohn would write a better review of Tommy because Nick Cohn was a known pinball player and fan.
Wow.
So, yeah, really weird trivia. Like I said, I went down kind of a rabbit hole here. But yeah, I mean, the weird thing about this is, I was rereading the article today. It's pretty long. It's probably 4,000 words or something like that. And when you read it, it absolutely reads like something that's made up. Like there are things that he writes about, like internal motivations of people that there's no way you could know, in very specific circumstances, you could know. I mean, he talks about the woman, the character that Annette in the film is based on, and talks about the scene with the roll of condoms, and ascribes motivations to her where it's like there's no way anybody actually was there and documented that, So it's like clearly this seems made up, but I think the forward to it basically says all of this is true. I just changed the name, so it's kind of bizarre that somebody would do that and then just 20 years later essentially admit that he made it up. But I think that's actually a really important part of this because again, the 70s were this moment when Americans were really rethinking so many class assumptions. And you have a British music journalist extrapolating things from his experience in nightclubs and in across the ocean. And this is a cosmopolitan person, right? Like this isn't the, folks who grow up in those working class neighborhoods in Brooklyn like you're talking about, Frank. And so he's imposing really kind of cosmopolitan views of how life should work onto what clearly, I mean, I don't think anyone argues that working class life in Brooklyn was difficult, whether you were Italian or Puerto Rican or African American. It most certainly was, particularly given everything that was happening in the national economy and with politics. But then to have somebody who's like not even embedded there for a few minutes, right? To basically impose these kind of cosmopolitan transatlantic values on the situation, it just creates a very distorted view of what things were like, and I think more importantly, what we should do. And again, the argument here is go to Manhattan, right? Go make the city your playground. You don't have any obligation to the community you grew up in to make it better and to organize with those around you. Just say fuck it and go to Manhattan and, you know, try to get a job, you know, where you're making a lot of money. And that's ultimately what Tony decides, you know? And so it's a massive imposition of, again, just like elite cosmopolitan values into this situation. And how could that not, even if people only remember the dance scenes like consciously, I mean, how could that not, if that's in the ether, have some bearing on how people thought about class politics in the decade?
That's such a good point, because it ends and it feels like this is a rom-com. And so like the ending is so, even though the film is so dark, it ends on a note where it just sort of apologizes, and you're supposed to be in love with Tony, and you're supposed to be hoping that Tony makes it to Manhattan and all is well. And it is such a disappointing message at the end.
Yeah, I mean, he basically, you know, attempts rape, and then at the end is like, I was about to do a John Travolta voice, but I won't do it. But he's basically like, I'm sorry, you know, like, can you forgive me? And she's like, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah,
we'll be friends.
yeah, I can.
And you know, this is, yeah, it's deeply problematic. It's deeply problematic.
There's something this movie does, I think, really well, especially with Tony's character and his his group of terrible male friends, which is, it's almost like a conflation, but I think they are in fact linked. This idea of, well, one, class aspiration. They're all talking about getting out, wanting the better thing. You know, we're reminded regularly that Tony's job at the paint store is not where he wants to be. He sees the old guys around him and he's like, this can't be where I get stuck. This can't be my future. So there's that class aspirational stuff that's also demonstrated through Stephanie's character, who is, you know, she's on her way out of Bay Ridge. When we meet her, she's working at an agency. She's a secretary at an agency. She is moving into her Manhattan apartment. She has class mobility, and that's what Tony is aspiring to. But then there's the whole other element of the disco and what that represents to these young men at this time in their lives, because we're told, you know, they're all working these dead-end jobs, more or less, and they save up their week's pay, and they all go blow it on Saturday night. Because this disco, the Odyssey, is the place where they have the highest status, and they wouldn't, you know, they're not doing the class analysis. They're not able to look at it and say like, oh, what is it about this place that's drawing me here? It's that, you know, I feel this sense of liberation and status that I don't get elsewhere in my life. And just how a lot of young people are chasing the sort of that high of freedom and that feeling of, you know, being reckless with your money on one night. It makes you feel like you get to be free in a higher class than you are, and like there's no repercussions to your actions, which I thought this movie like blended really beautifully, because there's like the actual class stuff, and then there's just more of like I want to be free, I want to live my life, I want to feel in control, I want to have all of that stuff that is represented by the disco.
Yeah, and there's definitely like a pop culture ethos around this time. One of the songs I was really thinking of wasn't. The Bee Gees songs actually capture that really well. If you think about the lyrics to "Staying Alive," you know, I'm going nowhere, somebody help me. But you know, the Bruce Springsteen song "Out in the Street," which came out in 79 or 80, something like that, and he says, "When I'm out on the street, I walk the way I want to walk. I talk the way I want to talk." You know, that you've got this sort of like stultifying, you know, work life, and that's how you actually, you know, kind of become free, is by getting out and engaging in this kind of youth culture. But you know what? As we're talking about this, one of the things that strikes me about it is like there is an element of moral panic here too, actually, right? That like, especially if you read the Nick Cohn story, you know, he talks about Tony feeling like he's the king now, but that's only going to last, you know, for a short time. I'm already old, right? He's like 18 or 19. He's too old. There's going to be somebody else, and so you know, a lot of this is, you know, you've got these young people in Brooklyn who are engaging in sexual acts and you know, out in the nightclubs, and they're not being responsible, and that comes on the history of like decades of like different moral panics in the United States around youth, right? So like, I'm sure you all know the song "Rock Around the Clock" by who is that by? Whatever that guy's name is, but it's a very famous song. That comes
Bill
from
Haley.
Yes, Bill Daly. that comes from a movie in 1955 called Black War Jungle, which is in many ways kind of similar to this film in terms of the like moral panic about the youth. It's set in schools. It got a very young Sidney Poitier in the movie actually, but there was a whole moral panic in the 1950s about young people and rock and roll, and then in the 60s around hippies, and so like this is just it kind of fits into that. As I'm thinking about it, it kind of fits into that mold actually, right? Like you could see a kind of updated version of this that Nick Cohn is like, well, like this will get attention because people are kind of primed to want to think about, this young generation. I mean, now today it's pronouns, right? This young generation that is just like uprooting everything. And it's a story that's like as old as time, at least in modernity,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know what I loved on this? This was a second watch for me, and I loved the dance stuff really impacted me on this watch in a way that I felt like this was so much about the importance of art, particularly for the working class. Because this was so about dance, the importance of dance to this community. Because like you were saying, Frank, this is the one place where people come together and can actually they talk about it as being high, but I think it's just like, it's where all the shit from the outside is gone and they're engaging in dance and art and its creativity. Like it's true creativity. All the bad stuff happens outside of that space. They don't actually ever get into fights. I don't think there's any big fight scenes like in the dance hall. Even all the I mean, what's pretty profound is like all the racist stuff that happens. It's like the time that Tony is actually the most likable is inside of the dance club, when he makes the most sense, because he gives at the end of the film, when he gives the award to the Puerto Ricans, because like we all see, we're like, yeah, dude, you're not as good a dancer. Mm-hmm. Like from the beginning of the movie, you weren't even like, to me, what I love is like, they're not actually great dancers. It's not like, I mean, I know people thought, and Travolta's moves and he's great, but he's not Patrick Swayze. Like they didn't fill this with professional dancers. And Stephanie to me is hilarious because you're like, she's not a great dancer, but they're loving just being in their bodies. And there's so much between Stephanie and Tony that like they can't explain, but there's so much I think they have permission to relate in this deep emotional way that like culture and society and class is not allowing them to do. And they feel, we can, especially for Stephanie, like I have to speak a certain way to get across and be seen. And for Tony and the boys, they have to portray a certain amount of machismo, and all of them are putting on these roles outside of the club. And like the dance is just so beautiful. Like it's an art form. I mean, I think in that way, this film is really, really beautiful, and it has something really important to say about working class arts and theater and culture that is like outside of like sort of that bourgeois Manhattan, what's happening on Broadway, or even what's happening in this film. Like you said, a bunch of people who are not from this culture per se making a movie about it, extrapolating it to make it mainstream.
Well, that's the thing that distinguishes Tony from his friends, is that Tony does have a pure passion for dance. He clearly cares about this a lot. He practices. He wants to get better. He has aspirational thoughts about what he wants to do with his dance, whereas his friends are just there. They're just there to get laid. They're just there to party. They're just there to
disagree, because remember when they say they're like, we love watching him dance. Like they watch him and they watch them, and I see them sitting on the edge, and I think they're sitting there actually not. That's the period of time that they're not like sort of fully involved in like all this other bad stuff. They're like loving watching him dance, which feels so antithetical to their macho, homophobic stuff.
Yeah, but I still feel like they're wielding so much power within the disco. Every time a woman comes up to them, they are so dismissive. They are insulting to like every woman that approaches their table. And clearly, like Travolta is, when Travolta wants to be, he is a very good actor. Sometimes he is absolutely off the walls, like in The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, which is a great watch, but he's just like on another planet. But in this, he's
good.
He's very good, and you see the shift from between him in the paint store where he's playing lower status to him in the disco playing higher status. And I agree with you that there is a pure artistic expression there, but Tony is getting off on how much power he wields within this space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and the other thing I would add to this, I mean, I don't have anything to add to the kind of art form of the dance, except to say that it's fun. You know, you watch this movie and it's fun to watch people dancing to that, and the music is great. I mean, the music that the Bee Gees wrote for this, I mean, I've been like listening to it in the past couple of days because, you know, and I never, you know, that sort of disco scene is, you know, it's kind of so ubiquitous, right? It's part of the soundtrack. You hear disco like just kind of at random intervals, but like when you actually stop and listen to it, the Bee Gees songs were really good. I mean, and so that's one of the things that makes this a fun movie. Like there's, and Rivka, I kind of get what you're saying in the sense that like the scenes that are fun in the movie are the ones on the dance floor, right? And so for us as a viewer, Frank, I think all the stuff you're saying is true about the power dynamics in the dance hall, in the nightclub. But like the fun scenes or the ones that are emotionally taxing are the ones that happen outside the dance club, and the ones that are in the dance club are the fun scenes. And those are the ones that people actually remember, at least consciously, because, you know, they're fun, they're enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And what I thought was really interesting is that Travolta, they originally did a cut that they wanted it to just be close-ups, and Travolta like went to war with the director, said, I'm going to walk from the film unless you recut it because I worked so hard on this dance. And he was right though too, that without the full dance, you also, again, to me, I think it's about something that transcends like all of the performance that they're putting on outside, and it just gets to this deep part where I think like every culture, everybody needs that, like a place. Dance is just such a ritual, and I think it taps into something important there. They also didn't know what music they were using. I mean, the Bee Gees hadn't written that until later, so they are doing these dances, like putting this movie together. Could you imagine as the actor not like having no idea what's gonna go behind?
That's wild.
They said they were, I think I read something that they were dancing to Stevie Wonder songs.
Yeah, totally different.
Yeah, for sure. But, you know, also like think about, there's some really important scenes early on. Obviously there's the kind of quintessential scene where Tony's walking down the street, but the one where he is in his room taking so much time to get ready, like that kind of lends credence to what you're saying, Rivka, in terms of the fact that like this isn't just about, I mean, for Tony, actually, he doesn't really seem to care about women all that much, right? At least for most of the film. It's a pride in sort of like how he looks and his appearance and like playing a role. I mean, that's something, think about what a departure that is from, I mean, this 1977, think about what a departure that is from like the typical ways that men are portrayed in films of at that point. You know, to spend all that time grooming, I mean, the kind of standard is like Gary Cooper in the Western who just like rolls out of bed and starts shooting people. And so I think there's something really, really important there in terms of the masculinity as a different form of masculinity, a level of aesthetic that people are taking seriously here.
Yeah, and in that scene where he has the Rocky picture, he has Pacino and I think Serpico.
Bruce
Lee. It's very conscious in that scene about like what he is putting on, like what that cover up is, who his role models are, and the whole film is him trying to find himself. It's unfortunate it doesn't lead to a place with a more satisfying solution, but he captures that. So I mean, it made me think a lot about, because when we talked about Rocky, about the impact of that on culture and what it means, like what masculinity means, and that this movie with that inside of it then has a whole other impact on the culture and on masculinity, and like the impact, like we're saying, of people not even recalling what the impact is on them, but that Tony Manero becomes this kind of godlike figure. But I think people are, you know, how much of the bad parts of him are taken on as well, just subconsciously. Like, it's pretty horrific. This had such an impact on the culture that I guess I read that disco was sort of not fully, like in 77, it had kind of been a passing fad. It wasn't really a thing that was happening, and this like brought it back. Just makes me think about like the ways in which art is meant to mirror society, but then sort of becomes this funhouse mirror right back and has these implications that get bigger and bigger.
100%.
Something that's amazing to me that's stuck out right in the first scene, because there's the opening shot, the opening sequence is the famous Tony walking down the street while Staying Alive is playing. And, you know, we all knew that pop culturally even before we saw this movie. We saw it parodied, we saw it referenced over and over and over again. You know, John Travolta walking down the street, Staying Alive, looking hot, disco. What stuck out was the paint can. He's carrying a paint can. And that's the thing that is completely lost. Like we're saying, like there's all the dark gothic stuff that's lost and all of the class stuff that's lost. But that's what makes that image so striking, and at least for me, why it resonated so much was immediately you see this guy who is strutting down the street like he's the hottest shit on the planet, but he's carrying a paint can. So immediately, as the audience, you're thinking, well, this guy's doing work. This guy's, this guy's a worker. This guy, like, some high class guy who's just like dressing hot and, looking like this is not painting his own house. So what's going on with this guy? And then he puts the shirt on layaway. He's, like so many times he's hitting on the woman that he's, completely out of his league. But I thought it just was such a brilliant setup for Travolta's character.
Yeah, for sure. And then, when he gets into the paint store and has the interaction with the paint store owner, that's really important. This is the moral panic stuff that I'm talking about, right? So, like, on the one hand, the adult figures in the movie are definitely seen as the Brooklyn people who are, holding him back. But, the paint store guy has a point, right? I mean, Travolta says, you remember the line? He says, "Fuck the future." And the paint store guy, who's, I assume he has a name, but I don't know it, was
Mr. Fusco.
Yeah, he's like, "No, Tony, like, the future fucks you if you don't pay attention." And so, like, that, that guy's a working class guy. He's actually a stand-up guy. He basically says, "I treat my workers well. Like, I've had so and so here for 15 years, and for the the cosmopolitans out there like Nick Cohn, that's maybe something that's holding them back, but that's actually the kind of fabric of the working class, community. There are people like that who have that kind of ethos, and it's partially dismissed in the movie, but at the same time, it's also seen as like, look at these young people who are not actually taking any responsibility. So I think there's kind of both things going on there. I had that kind of like dual reaction to it.
And then all of that is reinforced by Tony's family, which we haven't really talked much about yet. His parents and his older brother, Frank Jr., who is a priest until about 30 minutes into the movie when we find out that he has given up the cloth, and it has absolutely shattered his parents' expectations and aspirations for him. Yeah, because I was reading a little bit of research as well that Norman Wexler, the screenwriter, his big addition to the story that Nick Cohn had written was the Frank Jr. character, and creating a more fleshed out home life for Tony, so that we can see sort of the internal pressures that are coming from him there. But I mentioned it up top, but like coming from a similar-ish family, my dad would have been Tony's age, so my nana and nana would have been his parents' age, but that is a very real pressure that came, especially from like immigrant or first generation families. This idea of you have to accomplish some sort of marker of either like economic accomplishment or class or title accomplishment, whether that be with your job or what have you. And just how much that just completely fucks someone up. I mean, I pointed out to my family, in the last few years, I started pointing out to my family, because when, we have like a holiday or something, everyone will start talking, everyone will start gossiping about other people's kids or whatever. And the lines are always something along the lines of, "Did you hear about so-and-so? They got this big job and now they're making all this money." And just like, "You hear about this person? They bought a house that cost a lot of money." And I've started like asking my family, I'm like, why does it matter how much money they make? Like why does it matter? Like, give me your reasoning. And it usually throws them off. But yeah, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts about the Tony family dynamic.
So my great grandparents were Italian immigrants. They came to Philadelphia via Ellis Island. And so my grandfather, who recently passed, he had one brother. His brother did become a priest, Father Pat. And my grandfather was basically like locked in a room, like not literally like, all day, but like he came home from school as a teenager and was like locked in his bedroom because his parents wanted him to become a priest that badly. And they were basically like trying to get him to agree to it. And he held firm and didn't do it, which is good, because I wouldn't be here if that had happened. but yeah, he's obviously a little different generation than your parents, but it does speak to that, right? And speaks to those kind of pressures. And I think that's I think sometimes we romanticize these kind of like tight-knit working class communities. And when you think about the history of like labor struggle in this country, especially, from about the 1890s to the 1930s, with all of these just high profile strikes where not just all the workers, but, the entire communities were behind working people. These were the kind of communities that we're talking about where, and so the flip side to that is like, everybody knows each other's business. Everybody's talking shit about each other all the time behind each other's backs. And, like there's not the same level of like individual freedom that I think many of us, now are sort of accustomed to in terms of like, go do what it is that you want. I mean, those communities, elder folks had a lot to say about what younger people did. And so I do think that's something that's a tension that if this movie were done better, could have been a really interesting tension to have explored.
Yeah. I thought the family stuff was some of the most impactful. And I agree with you, John, if it had been, that's where probably more attention should have been paid because those dynamics were so interesting. And it was really important, the context that you added about where the country was at financially, particularly in this area, there's the pressure that the father is under and how the physical violence in the home gets exacerbated by those material conditions, by the stress of that. But also, the ideas around sex, there was that line where he says to why are you cleaning up dishes? That's woman's work. And, the little girl has to get it. And he gets really mad. His wife wants to get a job. No, that's not
a real
how
thing in an Italian household, by the way. That's
the
what the girls.
women's work?
Yeah, that's what the women do. Yeah.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I started helping my aunts clear the table, and they were like, "What the?" They were like, "What the fuck are you doing in here?" And I was like, "I want to help you." They're like, "Okay."
Weird.
Yep.
Yeah, really interesting. So I thought all of that and how that then resonated back into Tony is important. You see where some of that's inherited and how the pressures of this society affect the family. But yeah, a lot of and the consciousness around the violence, and some of the writing is so great in that. Like, don't hit my hair. You're always hitting my hair.
I loved when his dad said the line when Tony gets the $4 raise, and his dad says, "You know what $4 gets you this day? Doesn't even buy you $3."
That's inflation, right? And the father he's a legitimate asshole, right? But like, if you notice in one of those early scenes, the mom says, dinner's going to be late because the market was out of,
right.
I can remember exactly what she says, but a few things, or, and like that's what the 70s were like. I mean, gas shortages,
wow.
Just high prices actually impacting people's lives in a real way, not like what we've dealt with the past few years, which, it definitely like means something to working people, but like literally not being able to buy certain things like that happened in the 70s. Right.
And how under those circumstances, racism, sexism, homophobia gets increased. How there is that, where people want to say that has nothing to do with the economy. Like, there is a correlation. Those things increase when people feel tighter, when people are hungry, when people's needs are not being met, and they're not given, they don't have the education. There isn't a solution that they see connected to that, which is why making those connections are so important.
Or a union. And actually, now's the time I want to talk about something that I've been meaning to bring up.
Yeah.
So there's a book that a historian named Jefferson Cowie wrote probably almost 20 years ago now, but it was very influential for me in grad school. And the book is called Staying Alive, and the subtitle is like something and the last days of the working class. One of the things that Cowie does is he basically argues that the working class is written out of popular culture in the 1970s, and Saturday Night Fever is one of the movies that he looks at. And Cowie he's a good person. He was a good mentor for me actually in grad school. But one of my very good friends, and we went to grad school together. We were kind of both working on books about the 1970s at the same time. Her name is Lane Wyndham, and she wrote a book that basically said Cowie was totally wrong about that. And the reason that he's wrong about the working class kind of like diminishing in the 1970s is because he didn't write about the fact that the working class was truly becoming multiracial in the 1970s. And so what she does is she looks at union organizing drives in the 70s and some really high profile ones. One of the biggest ones is at a shipyard in Virginia in Newport News. where in spite of like huge odds from bosses trying to prevent workers from organizing, these people were still pushing for certification elections. In some cases, they were getting contracts, but what they ran up against was increased employer hostility, right? This is, you've heard of the union avoidance industry, right? These are the things that like Starbucks does now, right?
Yeah.
Like that was pioneered in the 1970s, right? And Harvey's probably talked about this at some point in your many conversations, but there's like a rise of corporate consciousness in the 70s, right? There's a very famous memo by a guy who later became, or very quickly after writing this memo, became a Supreme Court justice named Lewis Powell. Powell memo, yeah, who basically says like corporations got to get conscious and start like, cracking down on workers. And so it's in this context, what Lane documents is that workers are still having as many organizing elections as they had in the decades before the 1970s. They're just not winning as many because the tactics of the bosses are so brutal. And the ones that then the organizing that's happening in the 70s, a lot of it is interracial and cross-racial. So that is the alternative. You should definitely check out Lane Wyndham's book. It's a very important book. It's called Knocking on Labor's Door, and it shows really the alternative to this film, right? This film says, go to Manhattan, become professional class, save yourself. Lane's book tells us that in the 70s, what was actually happening is, this was a moment when women and Black people and Latinos were breaking into the kind of blue-collar jobs that they hadn't had access to before, and they were organizing with white workers, and that was the alternative, right? That was the real alternative, and that's one of the things that makes this movie so problematic in my view.
Yes. Oh, that's so important. I'm glad you shared that. That's the movie. Yeah, that's the movie I would like to see. I'm sure there's some movies that touch on it.
That's Norma Ray.
Right. That's right. We have to cover that. Not as successful as Saturday Night Fever.
Sadly, there's a little less disco in Norma Ray. I think if they'd had some Easy's in there, might have spiced it up.
Yeah.
Though the one thing this movie, I don't want to say it does well, because I found all of the racism, misogynism, and homophobia from our lead guys to be like quite detestable. I'm curious how much of that was intentional from the writer and how much of it was just, I don't know, the culture at the time. Because the one thing it did do was really, and it was another way for this group of Italian American guys, really white guys, to find another avenue for them to assert their dominance over other groups of people. And yeah, while I hated all of the slurs that they were using, I have to imagine it was intentional, because it felt so in your face in a way that was showing you like these guys are trying to exert their, like, men will do anything to exert their status. It's like the one thing that you could always count on men to do. So I thought, like, while it was, tough to watch, I thought it informed me as the audience a lot about like these men and their characters.
I think it was definitely intentional. I mean, Travolta basically says it. I mean, remember the line when he's leaving the dance after, he gives the trophy to the Puerto Ricans, and he basically says something like, everybody's dumping on each other. We dump on the Puerto Ricans. My dad dumps on my mom. We all dump on each other, basically. And so I think that's a thesis of the movie, right? And I think for Nick Cohn, and then whatever the filmmaker did with this too, like, I mean, you're right, Rivka. I mean, he definitely stayed true to the argument in the essay. There's a dismissiveness of working class people. It's basically like, oh, Travolta gets it. He gets that these people are basically ignoramuses, ignorami, I don't know what the word is, but like that they're basically like they're irredeemable, right? I mean, and that may as well call them deplorables. I mean, like, honestly, that's the kind of thesis here. And I emailed y'all about this ahead of time, but I want to bring this up now. I mean, this is kind of where not all Democratic politics, Democratic Party, I'm saying, but this is where the Democratic Party goes to some extent after the 1970s, right? They go toward professional class issues, gentrification. In this book that came out in the late 90s by this business consultant named Richard Florida, Florida has made probably millions of dollars with this grift called The Rise of the Creative Class, basically saying, like, we can't do anything to help blue collar people anymore. Like, that's the thing of the past. basically those people are place bound, and we need to embrace cosmopolitanism and urbanism. And the city, you shouldn't have any, you shouldn't feel any level of kinship to any community, because that's just not how life works anymore. Every city should be open for you as a creative person to make the city your playground. And that's the thesis, I think, at the end of this movie, is basically like, now we're going to go to Manhattan, and you just leave all those people behind. They're irredeemable, they're backwards, and you got to chart your own life. And think about the next installment in this movie, right? I haven't seen it, but I've read the synopsis. Now Travolta's a professional dancer, right? I mean, he's
Directed by Sylvester Stallone.
Yeah, wait, so Stallone directed that? Holy
Stallone
shit.
directs
that I
Staying
didn't see.
Alive.
Okay, I didn't see that. But think about it, right? Like that's the kind of thesis here. If you project it into the next movie, and it's just saying leave it all behind, leave all those working class people behind. They're irredeemable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard because there are, I will say, like, I do really love this movie. There's parts of it that I really, really love. And if it had had a different ending, I think it could have just shaped how you view so much of the film differently. If it had given a more truthful ending, a different, and I don't even know what that would be, a different realization or something, like you're saying, John, like that realization at the nightclub. But then he goes and tries to rape the woman he supposedly loves. There's the gang rape scene. There's the suicide, which again, all those events, there's something truthful about that, about not fully, that's very human, about having a realization and then doubling down on all of this reality. But then the end where he goes and it's like this rom-com apology, and she takes him in his arms and they're staring over the bridge, makes the whole thing feel acceptable. And I think that's just what it sort of happens in the aftermath, is like their behavior becomes, it's like this acceptable thing of like, well, they're just showing it how it is. It's pretty terrifying. Like I had the same feeling. It had this similar feeling that I had like watching Manhattan, and then going to people and being like, but did you know what it was about when you saw it in theaters and then talked about it like it was this beautiful movie with these gorgeous views of Manhattan? Why does no one talk about it, like about what it's actually about, which is about about raping this child, essentially, which Woody Allen does. And this whole generation of people, I mean, I remember being so mad at my parents, like, but you saw this in theaters and you weren't like outraged. I had a similar feeling with this, and it's because the storytelling at the end, again, feels very, like, manipulative. And so it loses out on all that beautiful stuff that's there, because there are beautiful things. Like the scene with Stephanie and Tony at the diner. I love some of that dialogue. It's so good, and the way they play it between the two of them, it says so much about class, and, like, it's just, like, humorous and, like, gorgeous, and they acted so well. When she's like, do you know Romeo and Juliet? Zeffirelli's like, oh yeah, I think I know, that's Shakespeare. She's like, no, it's Zeffirelli.
And he even asked, like, why did Romeo kill himself so quickly? And it's like, that's a pretty good question, actually.
It is. And then there's that scene where the two of them come back from Manhattan, where Tony thinks he's lost his job for this woman at the paint store, drives her into Manhattan. She meets the man that she's actually been living with, who treats her really shitty, who is like a guy from her office. So you learn more about her, which is interesting, and what she had to do to sort of be able to move across the bridge. And they come back and they stop on, like, the Bay Ridge waterfront, and there's just this gorgeous scene where it's like, talk about Travolta's acting, which I guess some of the backstory is during the filming of this, he had lost his girlfriend to cancer, so he's dealing with real grief. And they're just sitting there, and you see he's just wells up with tears, and that's the moment where you're like, oh, this movie has so much to say about what this person's going through and this experience. And then the end shits the bed. But there are some, like, incredible movies.
Is that where he's talking about the Verrazano Bridge and everything that went into it?
Yeah.
Beautiful scene.
Incredible detail.
Which is an amazing monologue for that, too. And, like, they're so soft with each other, and they just have such, the desperation for intimacy under all of, like, the horrific sex politics and how they treat each other, and how much of playing these roles gets in the way of just, again, the artistry they desire and the intimacy they desire.
Mm-hmm.
I think this movie shares a lot of DNA with Rocky.
Yes.
And it's so funny. I mean, there is a Rocky poster in Tony's room. Rocky only came out 1 year prior to this, so clearly, a few months later, they're in production, and they're like, "Oh, well, he's got to have a Rocky poster in his room."
Well, maybe that was an Avildsen, because the director of Rocky.
Oh,
was
sure,
the
yeah,
original
the director of
director.
Rocky.
Maybe he.
but that ending, I feel like there's two things happening. There's like the American dream individualism narrative that we've been, threading out, which is, like unspooling, which is you're the one special person. It is your responsibility to ascend, to escape, to go from one class to a higher class, and to leave everything behind. So like there's that element in the ending, and then, as you were saying, Rivka, Stephanie's forgiveness of Tony for attempting to rape her,
which she even calls out. She says a great line. She's like, "This is the first time I've left an attempted rapist inside my house."
Yep.
They name it. They're not pretending it didn't happen.
They're not pretending it didn't happen. But that felt, I don't know, that just felt very much of, 1970s rape culture. And why I brought up Rocky, because in watching Rocky, a movie that we all know is just like the fun boxer movie, the one scene where Rocky is actually courting Adrian is a coercion scene. It's like this giant hulking man cornering this tiny woman in his apartment, literally cornering her and moving in on her physically. And it's just, it's so wild, but also not surprising to encounter themes like that, like story beats like that in films from this era. It's just a reminder of how accepted rape culture was during this time. It's jarring, but it's also, it feels of the era, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Yep.
And that everyone went around and then saw these, and I mean, I don't know for sure, but that the discourse wasn't so, people were like, it was a great dance movie. That was a great movie about Manhattan. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
The other crossover with Rocky is they have the same trainer. That's why Travolta looks so damn good.
Oh, okay. I do want to talk a little bit quickly about Bobby C, one of the friends of the group, the guy who ends up committing suicide at the end, because I feel that really stuck out to me as like another big thing undergirding at least the dynamic within this friend group. So they have this friend, Bobby C. He's the one with the car. He's the one driving them around. He is the lowest status within this friend group, we're to understand. And I think also within the writing and the performance, we're supposed to gather that maybe he's, I don't know, maybe the least intelligent of these guys. But him and his girlfriend have just gotten pregnant, and from about halfway through the movie, he keeps telling Tony and his friends, like, hey, I've got this huge problem this huge thing that's happening in my life, and I don't know what to do. I have no faculties of how to deal with this. And he's just repeatedly ignored by his friends. And I thought it was so tragic and so sad. Because to me, it read as, even though this group of guys goes everywhere together, even though they are presumably in the same community, there's actually no real community between them, and so much of their relationship is superficial and just based on the time that they're in the Odyssey and they get to feel like kings. But there's actually no real communication or support or love happening between any of them, and it ends up driving Bobby to jumping off the bridge at the end. I just thought it was so sad.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely all that. It's also interesting, like when you think about, and when people listen to this, I hope to God we're not dealing with what we could be dealing with. But the question of reproductive rights, which is factoring so large in how people are thinking about this election, it also shows how lack of reproductive rights for women impacts men, right? I mean, because this is a man who, whatever. In a world where women had full reproductive freedom, the woman in here who's completely faceless, right? She's not even in the film. Would make whatever decision she would make, but it's clear that in this sort of community where abortion is a third rail, right? The priest is like, "What are you talking about? Like, you can't do that." He's trying to get the Pope to intercede or something, right? Right?
Oh my God, that's right.
Do you think? Can the Pope give Pauline an abortion?
But I mean, he's going to be expected to get married to her, right? Like, and so the lack of reproductive freedom impacts him too. And I think that's, think that's anything that the filmmakers intended, but it's it's kind of an interesting thing to think about and important, right? I mean, women's rights impact men ultimately, and I don't think enough men understand that.
Definitely.
Yeah. That was a really moving part of the film for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all of the large story beats and themes of the movie. We'll probably dig into some other things when we get to our awards, which we're going to give out right now. So, John, you may remember we have 3 awards that we give out. Our first award is Best Politics. So this goes to the character with the best politics in the movie. This is an interesting one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
First thing that jumps to mind is Mr. Fusco, the paint store owner.
Yeah,
I was going to
good
say
one.
that. Yep.
Working class guy, he is a boss for sure, and his employees are his employees, but he has guys that have been with him for 15 years. He gives Tony a raise.
And he takes Tony back. After Tony's just like, yeah, I'm not coming to work so I can drive my girlfriend, and I don't care if I'm fired.
Tony calls him an asshole.
Yeah,
Tony calls him
Tony's
an asshole.
To be fair, you could have been a little less of a dick about it, I think, who knows how many times Tony asks off for work, but if you got to get off work one day, it's not the end of the world. So he's a little bit of a dick there, but you're right. I do think he redeems himself. I could go with him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The priest isn't bad.
Oh yeah, Frank Jr.
Yeah, Frank Jr.
I mean, he doesn't have a great stance on abortion, but
but does he actually say?
Does he say anything?
Or does he just say fat chance getting the Pope to help?
Yeah,
you?
maybe just fat chance. But my guess is, if I
he
had to
did
guess,
leave the church.
He did leave the church.
So clearly he's I'm not into this. Mm-hmm. He also is the one that tells Tony, you have to, you got to go do something. It's not really politics. That's more just being a good big brother. But he's the one that says, yeah, he's like, this is something special. This is a real talent. You got to go chase this.
That's true.
But I don't think that's as clear of a politics as Mr. Fusco.
Yeah,
Anything
Mr.
else?
Fusco might be it. I'm like, there's not really.
Yeah,
It's
Nobody's
not
parents.
Stephanie.
Nobody else is great.
Yeah, Stephanie's got her politics all backwards.
Yeah.
I mean, Annette, we don't know much about her politics, but
Poor Annette.
Yeah.
Annette.
All right, I think Mr. Fusco. If someone pops up into our mind, we could maybe revise
Mr.
this.
Fusco's good.
We're gonna have an equally hard time thinking about the worst politics.
Woohoo.
Oh yeah, just because there's so many characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I
our
mean,
next award is worst politics. Character with the worst politics.
Yeah, this is, why it's also so tricky is because this is one of those movies where they don't really offer, there's no representation of the system or someone close to it. It's all the people sort of on the same level getting fucked in similar ways. So you can't be like, well, that's the one person responsible. There really is no, and that's interesting, I guess, because a lot of films that we've covered that are of this similar vein, even in Rocky, there's sort of someone who represents, or there's conversation represents that capitalist system or is a representation of Manhattan. I guess the only person here would be the dude that Stephanie is sort of with and makes that shitty comment. He kind of represents all that. So maybe it goes to him. I don't know if he has a name, but he has that horrible line where he's like, oh, I gave you those 2 books. Which one did you read? And she's like, oh, you should have read the other one. Just so demeaning.
And it seems clear that he's, exploited her in some way,
Totally.
right?
Yeah,
So
very clear. So it's probably
that's
him.
probably it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably that guy, that roommate. I mean, that would maybe throw in Mr. Monero, Tony's father.
But even he's complicated though, because you can tell part of this is that the system has fucked him, and even if he's a complete asshole about it, there are some extenuating circumstances there.
Yeah, I don't know if it would make him more shitty than anyone else.
That's true.
I mean,
what about who was the one who's? I mean, this is being more hot-headed, but if you're gonna was it Bobby? No, it wasn't Bobby. Who was the one?
Double J.
Double J, who's really hot-headed and goes after the Barracudas, even though. I mean, the dude, their friend did say, I thought it was the Barracudas, but he's super hot-headed and makes things a lot worse. Seems to be maybe a little more racist than everyone else, but who knows?
Yeah, he's also the one. He's also the one that rapes Annette in the back of the car at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go with him. Let's go with him.
He's probably
Yeah.
All right, Double J.
Double J.
Fuck that guy.
Double J. Bad.
our last award is Best Supporting Character / Spinoff. Goes to the supporting character that this movie should actually be about, or that we want to see a movie about. I know this one. This is a good. John, you emailed and you were like, we can't forget to talk about Fran Drescher.
Fran Drescher's role.
I didn't even realize it was Fran Drescher until I was watching.
I did not clock her. Where was she?
She plays Connie. Connie?
Yep.
She plays Connie.
Yeah, who says, I hope you're as good in, or what did she say? I hope you're as good in bad as you are on the dance floor.
Mm-hmm.
That was Fran Drescher?
That's Fran Drescher.
Yeah.
Wow. The SAG-AFTRA president.
Yeah, and she was so smart even back then. She was so young. And I guess they were allowed to do a lot of improvisation. And so she improvised the line, Connie's still waiting for her answer, because she was like, I refuse to just be girl on the dance floor. I'm giving my character a name. Smart. That's why she's our SAG-AFTRA president.
Yeah. I definitely want to see Connie spinoff, yes.
Totally. She was great. Probably has semi-good politics, too. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, she refers to herself in the third person. I'm very skeptical of all of those people. My vote in this would be Annette, just because I feel like Annette is such a tragic, other than Bobby C, is like the tragic character of this film, and really just goes through the ringer. I would just love to explore more of Annette's inner life, her home life, her work life. You know, what is it like? Where is she coming from when she arrives at the Odyssey and feels the need to be so subservient to Tony and this group of guys? I would maybe also watch like the Annette revenge fantasy movie. You know, when she, maybe it's a horror movie. She exacts her revenge on this group of men after what they did to her. So yeah, I felt like
I got one more.
Yeah,
I want to see the Adventures of Frank Jr. Where's he going?
Oh yeah,
where's he go?
Yeah,
that would have been really good.
That'd be good.
I could see a late '70s sitcom with that, right? Like where he goes to a different town each week, and it'd be like Quantum Leap, only entertaining.
And starring a former priest.
Yeah, those are all good choices. I will say with Annette and like all the women, it wouldn't have taken that much to give them just a little, like even a little bit more context. It was like they felt like it was enough to say, these women are all so needy and just desperate for attention. Because, there are women like that. Like, that was, like, the context, the justification for the film. Meanwhile, you get, like, all this justification for like, why these men are such fucking bigots and assholes. And you get nothing for, like, the women. Except for maybe Stephanie a little bit.
So let me say, right, maybe the worst politics in here is somebody who's not even in the film, and that's Nick Cohn, because all that shit is in the essay, right? He talks about...
Yes.
What does he call the men? He calls them faces, and he's like, no women are faces, basically. Like, sometimes they can build up their identity by being connected to one of these men who are on the dance floor, but they're basically just non-entities.
So fucked up that he made that shit up. Like, that's when you're like, okay, I get that, like, it's a fun fiction, but you're like, where is this fucking coming from? Sounds like you, Nick, hate women.
A little bit of like a projection of his own gender politics, right?
Yeah, totally.
Big time.
It's really, it's really crazy that all this came from that. Wow.
But that deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball. Just remember.
That's so wild that someone wrote that the Who wrote Pinball Wizard for a music critic.
They didn't write the song for it. They included it in Tommy because they wanted to have like a hit number that was, and Pete Townsend was like, this dude likes pinball, so we're gonna put it in there. That's what I read.
Wow.
All right, well, I think that does it for Saturday Night Fever. Truly a dense text. John, thank you so much for suggesting this. Rivka really, she mentioned it up top, but she has been desperate to do this movie. And this was a great conversation. I feel like we excavated as much as we possibly could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that this held up to your standards, and I think this one should win silver next year. So
agreed.
Let's shoot for that.
Absolutely.
And John, last thing we like to ask our guests before we leave, you've already answered this question, but is there something you do in your everyday life, whether it's an organization you work with or a daily practice you engage in, where you get the chance to practice your political values, whether they be anti-capitalist, liberal, progressive, leftist, what have you?
Well, I think the last time I was on here, I talked about my labor politics, and at the outset, I talked about the stuff we're doing politically in the state, and that takes up a lot of my time. But I still have a day job as a professor, and so I think what I'll talk about now actually is the work that I'm doing with my students, and the amazing thing for me is I've been at UW Green Bay for 12 years now. I knew nothing about Wisconsin before I came here. It's now my home, and our students here. They come from working class families. Their politics are, generally all over the place. But the thing that I'm seeing consistently now is a recognition among young people that this world as it's constructed, and by that I mean the political economy, isn't working for them. And they're open to everything from the idea of a universal jobs guarantee to healthcare, universal healthcare, and childcare and housing, because they're feeling the brunt of this, right? Like I hear from them, what student debt means to them and their anxieties about finding jobs and their anxieties about paying for housing. And so, the kids really are all right. And, they give, not that, I'm clearly doing a lot of work, y'all are doing a lot of work, but this next generation is one that, fuck all these people that are saying things about young people, spending too much time on TikTok and not knowing what they're doing. And, the same kind of moral panic, frankly, that we saw in this movie.
Right.
Young people get that this system isn't working and they're doing stuff about it. So that energizes me every day, and I'm glad to be doing that.
That's really hopeful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. John, It was so lovely seeing you. We got to do hopefully you'll be in New York at some point. We'll come out to visit you and Harvey, but would love to hang at some point.
Yeah, let's definitely do that. That'll be fun, and have fun when you see Harvey this week. Tell him I said hi, although I'm sure he'll text me between now and then. And thanks to you both for this show and for having me back. It was a real blast.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to support this show and get access to our Patreon episodes, that link is in the episode description in your podcast player or at mvcpod.com. Also, if you are a part of a leftist or progressive organization and you would like to advertise on this show, go ahead and shoot us an email at moviesvscapitalism@gmail.com.
For next week, we'll be watching the 2024 entry into the Alien franchise, Alien Romulus.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.